In 1570, one man ordered the execution of an entire city. Ivan the Terrible didn't just kill his enemies. He slaughtered children, priests, and innocent families in Novgorod. The death toll reached 60,000 in just 5 weeks. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Ivan didn't lose control in a moment of rage. This was calculated terror. He created a secret police force called the Oprichnina, specifically to carry out these mass murders. We'll examine 3 case studies that reveal his methods: the birth of Russia's secret police, the Novgorod massacre, and his ultimate act of madness when he murdered his own son. We'll break down how a childhood of terror unleashed Russia's first secret police. What drove a man to weaponize his own faith and family into instruments of fear? The answer lies in understanding how monsters are made. Ivan IV became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3 in 1533. Court records show he displayed exceptional intelligence for his age. He learned to read earlier than most royal children, and showed genuine interest in theological discussions. Foreign ambassadors noted his impressive composure during formal ceremonies. Ivan appeared destined to become one of Russia's greatest rulers. Everything changed when Ivan turned 8. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, died suddenly in April 1538. Chroniclers suggested poisoning, but no definitive proof survives. Rival noble families had opposed Elena's regency from the beginning. The Shwisky and Belsky clans saw her death as their opportunity to seize power. Within days of the funeral, these nobles began their systematic abuse of the orphaned prince. The Shwisky family took control of the palace first. They moved into the royal quarters while forcing Ivan into smaller rooms. Guards loyal to the young prince were dismissed or executed. The nobles would enter Ivan's chambers without permission and take whatever they wanted. They stole his food during meals, leaving the prince hungry. When Ivan's servants tried to intervene, the nobles beat them in front of the boy. Some servants were tortured to death as Ivan watched helplessly. The psychological torture extended beyond physical abuse. The nobles forced Ivan to witness public executions they staged for entertainment. They would drag condemned prisoners into the courtyard and make Ivan watch as they were hanged, beheaded, or torn apart by horses. The nobles laughed during these spectacles, pointing at Ivan's horrified reactions. They told him this was what happened to princes who forgot their place. Modern psychological research confirms that severe abuse before age 10 permanently alters brain development, making the fear response hyperactive while preventing normal impulse control and empathy from forming. Children who experience systematic torture often lose the ability to form healthy emotional bonds and begin viewing violence as the primary solution to problems. Ivan's first documented act of cruelty occurred in 1543, when he was 13. Prince Andrei Shwisky had publicly humiliated Ivan during a court ceremony, calling him a bastard boy in front of foreign diplomats. That night, Ivan ordered his personal guards to arrest Shwisky. Instead of a quick execution, Ivan chose something more creative. He had Shwisky dragged to the palace walls and thrown down to a pack of hunting dogs. The animals had been starved for days. Court chronicles record that Ivan watched from his window as the dogs tore Shwisky apart. Had these horrors wired him to see violence as the only answer? The next act confirms it. The killing gave Ivan a rush unlike anything he had experienced. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt powerful. The surviving nobles immediately showed him new respect. They stopped stealing his food and began bowing deeper during ceremonies. Ivan had discovered that extreme violence produced instant results where diplomatic approaches had failed completely. Over the next 3 years, Ivan refined his methods. He began studying historical accounts of Roman emperors and Byzantine rulers known for creative punishments. He ordered the construction of new torture devices in the palace basement. Ivan personally tested these instruments on condemned prisoners, taking detailed notes on which methods produced the most fear in witnesses. He was building a toolkit of terror that would serve him throughout his reign. By age 16, Ivan had learned the fundamental lesson that would drive his entire approach to governance. Fear was the only currency that guaranteed loyalty in Russian politics. Kindness was interpreted as weakness. Mercy invited rebellion. Only the threat of horrific death could maintain order in a court filled with ambitious nobles who had shown him their true nature during his vulnerable childhood years. The traumatized prince who became Ivan the Terrible had developed a worldview where every person represented a potential threat. His childhood experiences had taught him that people would abuse any show of humanity. The psychological foundation was now in place for what would become history's most systematic campaign of state-sponsored terror. But first, Ivan needed the right instrument to carry out his vision. In December 1565, Ivan IV announced a decision that stunned his own advisors. He would divide Russia into two separate territories. The first half would remain under traditional boyar rule. The second half would become his personal domain called the Oprichnina. This wasn't a simple administrative change. Ivan was creating a parallel state with its own government, its own laws, and its own military force. He had effectively declared war on half of his own country. Ivan needed enforcers to maintain control over this parallel state. He created an entirely new military organization called the Oprichniki. These weren't typical Russian soldiers. Ivan recruited men who had demonstrated their willingness to commit acts that regular troops would refuse to carry out. Many came from lower social classes with no family connections to established noble houses. Others were foreign mercenaries who felt no loyalty to Russian traditions or customs. Every Oprichnik carried specific ritual items attached to their horse's saddle. A severed dog's head represented their duty to sniff out treason against Ivan's rule. A broom symbolized their mission to sweep enemies of the state from Russian soil. These weren't mere decorative symbols. The Oprichniki would display the dog heads and brooms prominently during raids to maximize the psychological impact on witnesses. The Oprichniki uniform was designed to terrorize civilians. Each member wore long black robes similar to those worn by Orthodox monks. This created a deliberately twisted religious symbolism. The robes suggested divine authority, while the men wearing them committed acts that violated every Christian principle. The visual contradiction was intentional psychological warfare against a deeply religious population. The Oprichnina covered roughly 1/3 of Russian territory. Ivan handpicked these lands based on their strategic value and wealth. Traditional noble families received immediate eviction orders, and Ivan redistributed their estates to his new followers as payment for their services. Ivan's recruitment process focused on identifying men who lacked normal moral restraints. He offered enormous incentives to attract candidates. New members received confiscated noble estates worth hundreds of times their previous annual income. They gained legal immunity for any actions taken in Ivan's service. The only requirement was absolute personal loyalty to Ivan himself, not to Russia or its people. But terror needed an engine, and Ivan found his in people with nothing left to lose. The Oprichniki conducted their operations during nighttime hours to maximize terror. Families would wake to find armed men breaking down their doors without warning or legal justification. The raids followed no pattern that civilians could predict or prepare for. Ivan intentionally kept the selection criteria secret. This meant every Russian family lived with the possibility that they might be next. Public torture sessions became routine in Oprichnina territories. The Oprichniki would drag suspected traitors to town squares and execute them using methods designed to create maximum suffering. They burned victims alive, tore them apart with hooks, or buried them up to their necks and let wild animals finish the job. These spectacles weren't punishments for specific crimes. They were demonstrations of what happened to anyone who questioned Ivan's authority. The Oprichniki operated completely outside Russian law. Traditional courts had no jurisdiction over their actions. Local governors couldn't investigate their crimes or protect their victims. Even the Orthodox Church couldn't offer sanctuary to people fleeing Oprichnik persecution. Ivan had created a state within a state that answered only to his personal commands. The psychological impact extended to Ivan's inner circle. Advisors who had served the royal family for decades began sleeping with weapons beside their beds. They stopped expressing opinions during council meetings, afraid that any disagreement might be interpreted as treason. Court records show that nobles began writing farewell letters to their families each morning, uncertain whether they would survive another day in Ivan's service. Within 2 years of its creation, the Oprichnina had fundamentally altered how power operated in Russia. Every decision was now filtered through the question of how Ivan might interpret it. The traditional relationship between ruler and subjects had been replaced by a predator-prey dynamic, where survival depended on avoiding the attention of Ivan's death squads. The system Ivan had created was about to face its ultimate test. His paranoia would soon target an entire city, that had committed no crime beyond existing under his suspicion. In January 1570, Ivan received intelligence reports claiming that Archbishop Pimen of Novgorod had entered secret negotiations with King Sigismund of Lithuania. The documents alleged that city officials planned to surrender Novgorod to Lithuanian forces and declare independence from Russian rule. Ivan studied these accusations for several days before making his decision. He would not simply execute the suspected traitors. He would eliminate the entire population of Russia's second-largest city. How do you exterminate an entire city? With a blueprint of brutal precision. Ivan assembled an army of 15,000 Oprichniki for the march to Novgorod. This force was 3 times larger than needed for a standard military operation against the city's defenses. The massive deployment was intentional. Ivan had designed this campaign not as a quick strike, but as an extended demonstration of what happened to cities that even considered betraying his rule. He personally supervised the loading of specialized equipment onto supply wagons. These included torture devices, chains, ropes, and instruments designed specifically for prolonged killing operations. The Oprichniki surrounded Novgorod on January 8, 1570. They sealed every gate and blocked all roads leading out of the city. No resident would be allowed to escape and spread word of the coming massacre to other Russian cities. Ivan established his headquarters in the city center and immediately began organizing systematic killing operations that would continue for the next 35 days. Ivan divided the city into sectors and assigned Oprichniki units to each area. The killing began with mass arrests during the pre-dawn hours of January 9th. Families were dragged from their homes and marched to collection points throughout Novgorod. Children as young as 5 years old were separated from their parents and held in makeshift prisons. The frozen Volkhov River became the primary execution site. Ivan ordered holes cut through the thick ice at regular intervals along the riverbank. Entire families were forced to stand at the edge of these openings. The Oprichniki would beat parents with clubs and iron rods before throwing them into the freezing water below. Children were forced to watch their mothers and fathers disappear beneath the ice before being beaten to death themselves. Religious buildings received special attention. Ivan ordered Orthodox priests burned alive inside their own churches, with dozens more unspeakable tactics employed throughout the city. Ivan participated directly in many of these executions. Contemporary accounts describe him moving between killing sites throughout each day, observing different torture methods and suggesting improvements. He logged every scream, timing each death for maximum terror. Ivan kept detailed written records of these experiments, noting which techniques produced the most fear in witnesses. The psychological toll began affecting even the Oprichniki after the first week. Several unit commanders approached Ivan privately to express concerns about the scale of the killing operation. They had participated in mass executions before, but never against an entire civilian population including infants and elderly residents who posed no possible threat to state security. Ivan responded to these concerns by executing the commanders who had spoken up. The remaining Oprichniki continued their work without further complaints. The killing finally ended on February 13, 1570. Ivan's official count listed 60,000 dead residents. Archaeological evidence suggests this number may have been conservative. The Oprichniki had systematically eliminated nearly the entire population of what had been Russia's most prosperous trading center. Novgorod never regained its former importance or population levels. The Novgorod massacre achieved Ivan's strategic objective. No other Russian city attempted to negotiate with foreign powers during the remainder of his reign. The psychological impact of the systematic killing spread throughout the country, creating a climate of absolute terror that ensured compliance with Ivan's commands. As Novgorod lay frozen and silenced, the seeds of paranoia only deepened. Next, he turned that rage inward. His mad spree reached its climax in the royal chambers on November 16, 1581. The victim was his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. The 27-year-old prince had become everything his father had once hoped to be. Court records describe him as intelligent, well-educated, and skilled in military tactics. Foreign ambassadors noted his diplomatic abilities during negotiations with European powers. Most importantly, the Russian people genuinely loved him. Ivan Ivanovich had grown up watching his father's reign of terror, but had somehow maintained his humanity. He advocated for mercy toward political prisoners and questioned the necessity of continued Oprichnina operations. The prince had married Elena Sheremeteva in 1581. His third wife after two previous marriages had ended in tragedy. Elena was pregnant with what could have been Ivan's first legitimate grandchild and potential heir to the Russian throne. The fatal confrontation began as a discussion about military strategy in the royal chambers. Russian forces had been fighting a prolonged campaign in Livonia with mixed results. Ivan Ivanovich had proposed a new offensive strategy that would require additional troops and resources. The younger Ivan believed his father was making tactical errors that prolonged the conflict unnecessarily. During this discussion, Ivan the Terrible noticed his daughter-in-law Elena was wearing clothing he considered inappropriate for Orthodox royal women. When his son defended his wife's appearance, something in Ivan's mind broke completely. The argument escalated rapidly from a discussion about clothing to accusations about loyalty and respect. Ivan began shouting that his son was challenging his authority, just like the boyars who had tormented him as a child. The paranoia that had driven decades of mass murder now focused on his own heir. Ivan grabbed his iron-tipped staff, a weapon he carried constantly for personal protection. Ivan struck his son in the head with the staff during a moment of absolute rage. The blow cracked Ivan Ivanovich's skull and caused immediate massive bleeding. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of the impact echoing through the stone chambers. The prince collapsed instantly, blood pooling around his head on the floor. In that echoing silence, a dynasty cracked. The sight of his dying son triggered an immediate psychological break in Ivan. He dropped the staff and fell to his knees beside the prince. Palace servants who witnessed the scene reported that Ivan began screaming for doctors and priests while cradling his son's head. He begged forgiveness from the unconscious prince, promising to abdicate the throne if his son would just survive. Ivan Ivanovich died 3 days later from his head injuries. His death eliminated the only competent heir to the Russian throne. Ivan's remaining son, Fyodor, suffered from severe mental disabilities that made him incapable of effective leadership. The dynasty that Ivan had killed thousands to protect was now doomed to extinction within a generation. The psychological impact on Ivan was immediate and devastating. Palace staff reported that he would spend entire days sitting in front of his son's portrait, conducting conversations with the painted image. Ivan would ask the portrait for advice on state matters, then wait for responses that never came. Sleep became impossible. He would wander the palace corridors at night, searching for his son's ghost. Guards reported hearing him calling out his son's name and apologizing for the killing. Ivan the Terrible died on March 28, 1584, just 3 years after killing his heir. He left Russia in the hands of his mentally disabled son Fyodor, whose reign would usher in decades of political chaos known as the Time of Troubles. Had he unleashed terror on thousands only to destroy the one person who could have saved him? The question haunted his final years and reveals the ultimate cost of unchecked power combined with psychological damage. 3 decades of terror began with one traumatized child and ended with a father's bloody hands. Ivan created the Oprichnina to weaponize his paranoia into state policy. He perfected mass murder in Novgorod, systematically eliminating 60,000 civilians. Then madness consumed even his own bloodline when he killed his heir in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Ivan's methods established the blueprint for modern tyranny. The ritual symbols, forced confessions, and mass surveillance tactics echo through later secret police organizations across history. His psychological profile continues appearing in dictatorships worldwide. The combination of childhood trauma and absolute power created a killer who ultimately destroyed his own dynasty. Every victim served his paranoid need for control, yet control remained forever beyond his grasp. If you want more deep dives into how absolute power corrupts the human mind, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Drop a comment on which tyrant you'd like us to expose next, and see you next time on Crime Republic.